Hej och välkomna till 1171 i Heidegger-serien. Vi spelar idag på Trädgårdsföreningen. Det gröna hjärtat, så att säga, för att använda metaforer, i Göteborg. Vackra blomsterarrangemang går ständigt att se här. En sprudlande skönhet som hela tiden slår mot en. Titta här. Dessa vackra färger. So we will continue exactly where we stopped in Buzsaki, chapter 5 still. How thought is action. Even got the very word where I stopped. And I would read the last sentence. We're talking about gaze and the difference in babies already in gaze, depending on their status. A critical observation was that the firing latency of these gaze contact neurons varied between 80 and 140 milliseconds, which is tens of milliseconds shorter than the response latencies to visual stimuli. This experiment therefore suggests that amygdala neurons do not respond to a particular visual pattern, but may be involved in selecting which parts of the face should be consulted when examining strangers. I interpret these findings to mean that emotions, which have traditionally been approached via sensory inputs, can be re-evaluated when viewed from the action side of the brain. The disengagement hypothesis may be used as guidance here as well. One of the oldest and most influential theories of motion was put forward by William James and the Danish psychologist Carl Lange, known today as the James Lange theory of emotion. The theory argues that emotions occur as a result of physiological reactions to the body signals that we normally do not detect, such as changes in heart rate and respiration. We run away not because we fear the bear, but we fear because we run away from it. Very good. In William James's words, my thesis, on the contrary, is that the bodily changes follow directly the perception of the exciting fact, and that our feelings are the same changes as they occur in the emotion. End of quote. Something to be taken to heart. It is starkly different from, so to speak, normal ideas, both on the part of neurology, psychology, but also from folklore, common sense. Not surprisingly, James's explanation is outside in. It is the body-derived signals whose conscious interpretation by the brain produces fear. The theory has been criticized multiple times over the past century, yet its appeal persists. Just look at the pause here. Emotion expert Jules Ledoux, working at New York University, recently discussed the distinction between brain mechanisms that detect and respond to threatening signals and those that give rise to conscious fear. Whereas the former can be studied in animals, such as pairing a place with an electric shock and examining neural responses during the process. Fear is a subjective feeling in the conscious domain that cannot be pinned down by simply correlating neural activity with overt responses to those signals. I agree. However, we can attempt to draw a parallel between mechanisms of cognition and mechanisms of emotions. As we discussed earlier in this chapter, cognition is a disengagement of the brain from the motor action system. Similarly, emotion can be conceptualized as a disengagement from the autonomous action system. In both cases, the fundamental physiological mechanism is the corollary discharge system. In case of emotion, it is the reafference from the brain's control mechanism of visceral systems to the amygdala and the neocortex. Although the phylogenetic roots of emotions may well be based on overt feedback from the autonomous system, more complex brains can disengage from it so that internalized feelings can occur in the absence of blushing, sweating, or pupil or respiration changes. In summary, internalization of the overt sensory feedback in the James Lange theory can be an alternative way of conceptualizing and researching emotions. Providing anatomical support for the gestural communication hypothesis. Area F5 in non-human primates and Broca's speech area in people are homologous brain regions. Broca's area may have evolved atop the mirror system for actions and provided a seed for generating and reading motor sequences of speech. Similarly, the parietal mirror system could be a precursor of the Wernicke's perceptual speech area. Through such evolutionary development, the combinatorially open repertoire of manual and body gestures could have provided scaffolding for the emergence of proto-speech vocalizations, leading eventually to language with syntax and compositional semantics. The observation execution matching system could have linked action to social communication, culminating in linguistic syntax, so that an effective sender to receiver relationship could develop between actor and observer. Now, very important for you who have studied Ian McGilchrist and also Richard E. Lind and Lakoff Johnson's. In the line with this hypothesized evolutionary path, action as symbolized by the verb in language is the architectural centerpiece of a sentence. The verb. You cannot master a language without learning the meaning of verbs. Verbs express intentions and encode what is happening in motion. As engines of syntactic action, very good, engines of syntactic action. They can have a large entourage in a sentence. A verb can specify the action or event. Describe the trajectory of an action with respect to some reference spatial point. Indicate whether an action is completed or ongoing, and select the semantic roles of the participants in an action. Verbs in many but not all languages have a tense referring to past, present, or future. They express not only the intent but also the mood of the speaker. For example, ambulatory movement can be described by a variety of verbs that refer to different speeds, moods, intentions, directions, and patterns of walking. In essence, allowing the listener to visualize action. Verbs in many, but not all languages have a tense referring to past, present, and future. They express not only the intent but also the mood of the speaker. For example, ambulatory movement can be described by a variety of verbs that refer to different speeds, modes, intentions, directions, and patterns of walking. In essence, allowing the listener to visualize the action. I'll repeat it because it's incredibly important. I would say it's decisive. The process that gives meaning to verbs and relate them to motor actions and real-world experiences is called semantic grounding. An initially meaningless sound pattern acquires meaning to the listener. After this learning process, whenever the pattern recurs in the brain, it can bring back the simulated or constructed thing, even when the thing or the episode is not present. The specific neural mechanisms underlying semantic grounding of nouns and words in general are not known, but they are based on our interaction with the environment in unique ways. This is it's a lot to take in. So verbs, of course, motions, directions, speed, in a way location, but the nouns and the words in general, they seem to be derived from the verbs. How do we account for those? For example, up and down have positive and negative meanings, respectively, in most languages. likely because of a number of motor actions that lead to reward, require an erect posture, combating the gravitation forces we live in. She woke up, he fell asleep, I'm feeling down, his income is high, mine fell. Things in the lab are going downhill, or she couldn't rise above her emotions. Numerous examples in language are based on action metaphors. Digesting these pages, he killed my brilliant idea. Einstein's theory gave birth to a new era. Einstein's theory gave birth to a new era. Early learning in human infants often takes place in the context of active exploration of objects. Infants do not simply look passively at the jumble of toys on the floor, but rather use their body, hands, head, eyes to select and potentially visually isolate objects of interest, thereby reducing ambiguity at the sensory level. Of course, the process of reducing ambiguity is the idea of action-assisted grounding, or, as Wittgenstein noted it more eloquently, our talk gets its meaning from the rest of our activities. Pointing by hand to objects, or just gazing at them in humans, is an efficient gesture to invite joint attention between communicating individuals. Psychophysical lesion recording and transcranial magnetic stimulation studies suggest that motor cortex and somatosensory cortex are involved in linking action words to their direct meaning, whereas the inferior frontal cortex, temporal lobe, and inferior parietal cortex encode more abstract features of action words. As in spoken language, auditory feedback when playing a musical instrument is necessary to learn how actions leads to the desired effect. Copies of the planned action from premotor cortices are sent before the sound feedback arrives. Once this corollary system has been trained, sounds can be imagined, even in their absence. But remember, not before the training. This may explain why many deaf people can speak, sing, or even compose music if they lose their hearing after acquiring language, although they have difficulty regulating the volume and the pitch of the sound. Beethoven became virtually deaf by the age of 44. Yet he continued to compose extraordinary music for the rest of his life. In contrast, no composer born with hearing loss is known. The corollary feedback loop of the action system must be calibrated before it can be developed in a useful way. To recapitulate, the mirror neuron system allows us to read the intentions of others by interpreting body language. The expansion of the action system to spoken language permitted us to establish an extensive and effective communication system by interpreting speech, which can be viewed as a metaphoric form of action. The invention of language accelerated externalization of brain function, creating a collective species memory. To enable cognitive operations, the brain should be equipped with mechanisms to separate and combine neural messages, similar to the syntactical rules of language. Wow. That is very explanatory. Similar to the use of language. How neural networks support this operation is the topic of the next chapter. Summary. We discussed several examples of how disengagement of brain networks from the external inputs can be useful for cognitive operations. The key physiological mechanism of this scenario is a corollary discharge-like system that allows the brain to interpret the activity of action circuits even in the absence of overt movement and sensory feedback from muscles. Remember the music example there. The sensory feedback is vital in the beginning to establish. Vital. It makes the whole change. It makes everything roll, so to speak. Within such an internalized world, brain networks can anticipate the consequences of imagined actions without the need to act them out. Very, very important. This learning begins at 4 to 5 years old. Could start earlier, and the child usually in these circumstances remain slightly passive for a while. But the child is not passive, it is considering. It has internalized action, does not need to perform them externally, but can plan. This is the start of planning. Instead, the outcomes can be tested against previously acquired knowledge which creates new knowledge entirely through self-organized brain activity. This is so great. Must be the best summary I've read in ages. So to speak, in a nutshell. So it must all be movement, it must be a feedback. We will need to have that feedback to establish an internalization, and it needs to go about in that order, of course. It cannot be skipped. There is no leap to be made here. Any leap would be detrimentous to the individual. And I would say some leaps, or big leaps, might be unavoidable in some people to their demise. Well, think yourself if your internalized models are not. The quality of them will decide how your planning works. The lower the quality, the lesser the outcome, the prediction, and the lesser you will be able to reach effectively into your memory system. That is not automatic. We know that from the cerebellum studies. No one on this planet can access their memory to the same level. We are incredibly different because of how much training we put in. And if we skipped a step or two, for the sake of simplicity, I portrayed externally and internally driven activities as separate processes that emerge sequentially during evolution. In reality, these steps are only abstractions. The logic of this framework is not that the networks of a small brain depend entirely on external inputs, and larger brains switch to internal operations. Instead, the two processes are inherently intertwined. This is the Klein bottle, remember, and the same circuit can perform both input dependent and input disengaged operations. For example, the head direction system can momentarily disconnect from environmental and body derived cues to extrapolate the imagined head direction via internal mechanisms. Spatial navigation, especially this fantastic thing, dead reckoning. I will just make a repetition of it because it's so marvelous. Dead reckoning is a way that we always find our ways before we even look. It's called dead reckoning. You don't have any location clues. This is the spatial and temporal action of our system. And as you can possibly understand, dead reckoning and in combination with spatial locationism can be developed incredibly. I can't really see any limit to that development. And now we are very far from a dead space around us. Dead homogeneous space that is just out there, and we sort of walk in that map. No, these things are permanently intertwined. We cannot separate them. Separation is in itself a fault of thinking or a lack of knowledge. I don't know how to put it, but somewhere in that between. Let me read this again. For example, the head direction system can momentarily disconnect from environmental and body-derived cues to extrapolate the imagined head direction via internal mechanism. Spatial navigation, especially dead reckoning, assumes some kind of memory. Larger brains may have more capacity for internal processing, yet even in a complex brain, memory recall can be improved by external information. When a narrative gets stuck, a simple cue comes in handy, which is why people prepare a list of keywords for talk. In other words, even small brains have elements of internal operations, cognition. But as the complexity of neural networks increases, the share and efficacy of internalized computation also increases. Therefore, complex neural networks with numerous interactive loops in larger brains can predict the consequences of the brain's actions over much longer time scale and in more complex environments than smaller brains. So this is Wittgenstein or Heidegger in neurology. We have always been in the world, and it's a development. Understanding comes from training, and without interaction there is no understanding. And we can no longer say that understanding something is reflecting upon it. All of a sudden, this reflective consciousness, or the ego, or the what can you say it? The mirror image, as Rudolf Gachet called it. It becomes weird. What is that? I would say that it's the mirror neuron that mirrors something in the processes by disturbing. It is not a true self at all. As we talked before, it's not persistent over time, it doesn't have any permanence, and it's a stressful thing, a very short take on reality. Whereas when you are engaged in the world, you learn your language words through gestures, movement, directions, intentions. Your verbs come more and more to mean things. They are not just out there in the transcendental world. You train them, you've done them, and you will continue to do them in a muscular fashion until they become more and more internalized. Once they are internalized, they will continue to develop as long as you put your focus to them. But if you go to the classic move, it will stop. That's the attitude. I don't care about reality. I don't engage. I don't want to think abstractly. and I don't want to be practical. I just say to myself and to the world and put a posture. It's always a muscular tension, because this movement, this verbal understanding, which is understanding, can only be stopped by tension. This is why we tense, and I'd say this is also why we collapse, because we often today collapse and tensions. We stop our thinking by tensing, stop our development, we stop our abstracting, and we stop our practical movements, and that makes us tired. All day long we strive to stop, to hinder, and to keep that little we have left. And the more we tense, the more we lose. It is a development, a progression that diminish more and more, and the more you lose, the more you tense. Rodolphe Gasquet called that the nullification. He depicted elegantly in The Tainted Mirror, the taint of the mirror, how we in the modern world have come to stop to think. Being abstract, having concept, has become something really bad. It has become something we shouldn't do. So instead we repeat, and there for every repetition, which is more automated, our awareness disappears. Our consciousness itself sips away. And to quote Heraclitus, this is when you put a lump of salt into water, the soul dissipates, it disappears. Awareness disappears in the same moment you think awareness is looking at something and directly mirror it in your thought. It's not hard to see how that disrupts all thinking and attention. In the end, you will start looking there, 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 there. And as you do that, your thinking will be here, there, there. And this is also in the body. The direction of the head is very important thing, gets also disrupted. It doesn't have any directionality anymore. Therefore, your thinking is no longer decisive. It becomes unthankful, just as Heidegger. So Martin Heidegger is going to end this lecture. I say thank you very much from this beautiful garden, and have a very pleasant time. Bye bye for now.